So clearly, we've got a player and a coach now that have two completely separate belief sets. And look, Stephanie White was angry when she made those comments. So you can bet one thing, I'm going to be watching and paying attention to Sophie Cunningham's minutes. If she all of a sudden has a reduction in minutes playing.
The Indiana Fever's front office has been making phone calls all week, and none of them are about basketball. Behind the polished press releases and the carefully worded team statements, something has gone catastrophically wrong inside that franchise, and the people in charge are absolutely terrified that you're going to find out exactly what it is. But here's the thing about secrets in the age of the internet. They don't stay secret for long. The leaks are out. The audio exists, and what's been happening inside that locker room makes everything you've seen on the court look like a minor disagreement between friends. This isn't about one bad game or one rough stretch of the season. This is a full-scale institutional collapse, a war between players, coaches, and front office executives that has now dragged in national media, political figures, and an entire country watching to see who blinks first. The Indiana Fever, once positioned as the most exciting franchise in women's basketball, has officially become the most explosive story in all of American sports. And right at the center of it all, you have three names: Sophie Cunningham, Stephanie White, and Caitlin Clark. What happened between these three women in the past several days didn't just shake a locker room, it rewrote the entire power structure of the WNBA, and the aftershocks are still being felt right now. So buckle in, because we are going to walk through every single layer of this scandal from the very beginning. By the time we're done here, you'll understand exactly how a locker room goes from a championship contender to an absolute war zone, and why the people responsible for this mess are the last ones willing to admit it. To understand how all of this exploded, you have to understand who Sophie Cunningham actually is, because the media has been doing her a serious disservice. The narrative being pushed in certain corners of sports journalism tries to paint her as a fringe voice, an outlier, someone who doesn't represent the broader pulse of the locker room. But that story completely falls apart the moment you actually look at the facts. Sophie Cunningham is not a rookie trying to make a name for herself by stirring up controversy. She's a seasoned, respected professional who has built her entire reputation on being exactly what she appears to be: direct, unapologetic, and completely immune to social pressure. On the court, she plays with a physicality and a fire that most players in this league simply don't have. She gets under your skin, she gets in your face, and she absolutely does not back down. That same energy, it turns out, extends far beyond the hardwood. When Cunningham stepped in front of the microphone and delivered her now viral statement about protecting women's sports, she wasn't doing it for clout. She wasn't doing it to grab headlines or to position herself for some post-basketball media career. By all accounts, from people who know her, she said what she said because she genuinely believes it, and because she had grown tired of watching everyone around her stay silent on something she felt mattered deeply. Reports suggest she had been holding this in for a while, and when she finally spoke, the words came out with the kind of conviction that you simply cannot fake. She made clear that her position wasn't rooted in hate or in targeting any community. She was careful, actually, to frame her comments around something specific: the protection of young girls in competitive sports and the preservation of Title IX, the landmark legislation that gave women's athletics the foundation it stands on today. She said plainly that she extends love to everyone, that she doesn't dislike anyone, and that she has never claimed to hate the trans community. But she also said something that a lot of people in that league have been thinking and refusing to say out loud: that biological women in sport deserve protections that are clear, enforceable, and non-negotiable. The reaction was immediate, and it was massive. Within hours, the clip had spread across every major social media platform. Millions of people were watching, sharing, and responding. Fans who had never paid attention to the WNBA were suddenly very interested in Sophie Cunningham. Sports commentators were debating the substance of her statement, political figures were weighing in, and the comment sections were absolutely on fire, a mixture of fierce support and sharp criticism that showed just how deeply this topic cuts across American culture right now.
Sophie Cunningham says, the article says, you say she's a MAGA Barbie, as some corners of the internet have taken to calling her. Projection, she says, because of what she looks like and where she's from. She'll weigh in on how to, quote, protect women's sports, she says, because she's in that world and feels qualified to speak to that world. Quote, I got a lot of negative feedback about me hating trans, and I'm like, I never once said that, she says. I think that I'm here to extend love, but I also think with that love.
For a brief moment, it looked like Cunningham had managed to do something rare in professional sports. She had sparked a genuine national conversation about a real issue, and she had done it without backing down, without walking it back, and without issuing one of those hollow, PR-managed non-apologies that athletes usually put out within 48 hours when the heat gets too intense. When reporters showed up at the next media availability and pushed her to clarify, to soften, to reconsider, she looked them directly in the eye and said 4 words that immediately became the most quoted phrase in sports that week. I said what I said. That was the moment the front office completely lost it. Here's what happens inside a professional sports organization when one of their players goes viral for something that wasn't pre-approved, pre-messaged, and carefully coordinated with the PR team. The phones light up, the group chats explode. Executives who hadn't thought about Sophie Cunningham in weeks are suddenly in emergency meetings trying to figure out how to contain the story before it takes on a life of its own. And in the Indiana Fever's front office, according to reports leaking from people close to the organization, that panic set in hard and fast. The franchise found itself in an uncomfortable position. On one hand, the statement Cunningham made was her own personal view, expressed outside of team-sanctioned media, which means the organization has limited legal ground to discipline her for it. On the other hand, the WNBA has cultivated a very specific public identity over the years, one that is deeply tied to progressive social values, inclusivity, and a particular cultural positioning that the league's leadership has invested heavily in maintaining. Cunningham's comments, however carefully she framed them, landed in direct tension with that identity, and the people running the Fever knew it was going to create pressure from above. What reportedly happened next is where this story goes from uncomfortable to genuinely disturbing. Rather than standing beside their player, rather than issuing a statement that acknowledged her right to hold personal views while reaffirming the team's values, Coach Stephanie White is said to have moved in the opposite direction entirely. Sources close to the situation, speaking on the condition of anonymity, have indicated that internal discussions about Cunningham's playing time, her role in the offense, and her standing within the team's hierarchy shifted dramatically in the days following her viral moment. Let's be clear about what's being alleged here, because it's serious. We are talking about reported suggestions that a professional athlete was targeted for punishment, not for anything she did on the basketball court, not for a violation of team rules, not for conduct detrimental to the organization in any traditional sense, but for expressing a personal opinion during a media availability. Rumors circulating within the league suggest that the push to reduce Cunningham's minutes wasn't about basketball strategy, it was about sending a message. And Cunningham's stat line told the story without anyone having to say a word. After she doubled down publicly on her position, after she stood in front of cameras again and refused to apologize, refused to retreat, refused to give the front office the clean resolution they were clearly hoping for, her playing time in the very next game dropped to 7 minutes in the first half. 7 minutes for a player who had been logging consistent time throughout the season. The timing was not subtle. The timing was not a coincidence, and the people inside that building knew exactly what it meant, even if no official explanation was ever offered to the media. What Coach White reportedly failed to understand was that the moment you try to punish someone like Sophie Cunningham, you don't silence her, you amplify her. because now the story isn't just about what she said, it's about what happened to her after she said it. And that story is a whole lot more compelling, a whole lot more damaging, and a whole lot harder to contain.
There's a ceiling to how big most sports controversies get. They trend for a day or two, they get debated on a handful of podcasts, and then the news cycle moves on and everyone forgets about it. What happened with the Sophie Cunningham situation was fundamentally different because the topic she was speaking about isn't just a sports topic. It sits directly at the intersection of sports, politics, culture, and deeply held personal values. And that combination, in today's media environment, is essentially a rocket ship. The story crossed over from sports media into general news almost instantly. People who had never watched a WNBA game in their lives were forming strong opinions about Sophie Cunningham within 48 hours of that clip going viral. Conservative media picked it up and ran with it hard, celebrating her as a symbol of courage in an environment that they characterized as hostile to traditional views. Progressive commentators pushed back, framing her statement as harmful to trans athletes and questioning her motivations. The debate raged across every platform simultaneously, and it wasn't dying down, it was getting louder. And then, in a development that genuinely surprised even the most plugged-in political observers, the story reached the White House. Reports confirmed that an official statement from the administration was issued that publicly aligned with the substance of what Cunningham had said about protecting women's sports. The specifics of the statement and its exact framing were debated, as you'd expect in a politically charged moment like this, but the core message was unmistakable. The highest office in the country had weighed in, and the weight of that support landed squarely on Sophie Cunningham's side of the argument. Think about what that means for a moment. Coach Stephanie White had been operating under the assumption that she could quietly manage this situation internally. She thought she could reduce Cunningham's minutes, let the media cycle run its course, and emerge on the other side with her authority intact and the locker room back under control. Instead, she woke up one morning to discover that the players she had reportedly been trying to punish had just received the most powerful public endorsement available in the United States of America. The White House hadn't just validated Sophie Cunningham's right to speak. In the eyes of millions of people watching this story unfold, they had completely demolished the premise of any punishment being considered against her. The Indiana Fever's front office, which had been quietly hoping this would all go away, suddenly found itself facing a very different reality. This was no longer a manageable internal personnel matter. This had become a national story with political dimensions, cultural stakes, and an audience of millions who were now paying very close attention to exactly how this franchise treated the player at the center of it all. The pressure on Coach White didn't just increase, it multiplied in ways that nobody inside that organization had prepared for. Coach White had positioned herself on the wrong side of a conversation that had just gone fully national, and everyone in that locker room knew it. If you've been watching the Indiana Fever this season, you already know that Caitlin Clark has taken an extraordinary amount of punishment, and not just the physical kind. Yes, there have been the flagrant fouls, the hard shots that went uncalled, the kind of physicality directed at her that most star players in professional sports simply do not experience at the same frequency. But the off-court abuse has been just as relentless, and in some ways more insidious, because it's come from inside the walls of the league itself.
Veteran players have gone on podcasts and taken shots at her popularity, suggesting that her fan base is somehow illegitimate or that the attention she receives is unearned. There have been whispered allegations all season about tension within the Fever's offensive system, suggestions that certain members of the coaching staff have been quietly resistant to building the team's identity around Clark in the way that her talent clearly demands. She's navigated jealousy, resentment, and a level of institutional friction that most generational talents never have to deal with, particularly in their first full professional season. Through all of it, Clark has been remarkably disciplined in how she's handled herself publicly. She's been careful with her words. She's been respectful in press conferences. She's channeled her frustration into her performance on the court, rather than into public confrontations that could distract from the team. People who have watched her up close this season have described her as someone who absorbs a tremendous amount, who processes it internally, and who chooses her moments very deliberately. The Sophie Cunningham situation appears to have been one of those moments, because when reports surfaced that Cunningham was facing internal punishment for something she said off the court, when it became clear that the same environment of friction and quiet sabotage that Clark had been navigating all season was now being directed at someone she considered a genuine teammate and ally, something in Clark reportedly shifted. According to multiple accounts from people described as being close to the situation, what happened in that locker room was unlike anything anyone had witnessed inside that franchise. Clark, who had spent the entire season carefully managing her public composure, reportedly reached a breaking point. Witnesses describe her slamming her locker with enough force that the sound carried into the hallway. They describe her standing up in that room and saying, in words that have now been widely reported, something to the effect of, "Why is it always me you try to hold back, and now you're coming for Sophie too?" The message was unambiguous. Clark was drawing a direct line between what had allegedly been done to her all season, the quiet efforts to limit her influence, to manage her role, to keep the team from becoming too associated with her singular star power, and what was now allegedly being done to Cunningham as punishment for speaking her mind. She was naming the pattern out loud in front of witnesses, and she was refusing to pretend it wasn't happening. What made the moment even more significant was what came after the outburst. According to reports, Clark made her position explicit to the coaching staff and to the front office. If you were going to punish Sophie Cunningham for expressing a personal opinion, then you were going to have to be prepared to have the same conversation with the face of this entire league. It was a power move of the highest order, and it worked, because there is simply no version of this story where the Indiana Fever suspends both Sophie Cunningham and Caitlin Clark simultaneously without the entire franchise going up in flames overnight. Clark had effectively made herself the human shield, and in doing so, she didn't just protect her teammate, she exposed the entire architecture of dysfunction that had been quietly running this organization all season. Just when it seemed like the Indiana Fever couldn't possibly absorb another hit, a completely separate story detonated inside the organization, and the timing could not have been worse for a front office already scrambling to manage multiple simultaneous crises.
Reports emerged that a former staff member had come forward with allegations of workplace harassment inside the Fever organization. The name connected to these reports was Brianna Turner, and the nature of the allegations, as they began circulating through sports media, pointed to misconduct of a serious nature involving someone who was no longer employed by the franchise. The Indiana Fever moved quickly to put out a statement, and notably, they did so within 12 hours of the reports surfacing. The statement itself was carefully worded in the way that all organizational statements about sensitive personnel matters tend to be. It acknowledged the seriousness of the situation, reaffirmed the franchise's commitment to maintaining a safe and respectful workplace, and made clear that the organization takes concerns of this nature seriously and investigates them thoroughly. What it notably did not do was name names, provide specifics about what was alleged, or give any indication of what action had been taken or would be taken going forward. That deliberate vagueness, while legally understandable, immediately became its own story. Because people who had been watching this franchise closely all season, people who were already primed to view the front office with suspicion after everything that had unfolded with Cunningham and Clark, were not in a charitable mood when it came to accepting carefully managed institutional non-answers. The speculation online was immediate and intense, with fans, commentators, and media figures all trying to fill in the gaps that the official statement had left wide open. What made the Brianna Turner situation particularly combustible in the context of everything else happening was the contrast in response times. The Indiana Fever had issued a statement addressing the Cunningham situation within 24 hours. They had issued a statement addressing the Turner allegations within 12 hours. That speed, that urgency told its own story about how seriously the organization was taking the reputational threat these two situations represented, even if the content of the statements carefully avoided saying anything that could be used against them later. The broader picture that was emerging from all of this was deeply unflattering. In the span of just a few days, the Indiana Fever had gone from being the most exciting team in women's basketball to being a franchise dealing with a player punishment controversy, a locker room rebellion led by its biggest star, national political attention, and now a workplace harassment allegation involving a former employee. Any one of these stories on its own would have been a significant distraction. All of them hitting simultaneously was something altogether different. It was an organizational crisis of a scale that most professional sports franchises never have to navigate. And the person nominally responsible for keeping a locker room together, for maintaining trust between players and coaching staff, for projecting stability and leadership in the middle of all this chaos, Coach Stephanie White was nowhere to be found in any of this in any meaningful public way, which, depending on who you ask inside that building, might be the most telling detail of all. There is an art to crisis management in professional sports, and the Indiana Fever's front office has spent the last several days demonstrating that they have absolutely no idea how to practice it. Every statement they've released has had the fingerprints of a legal team and a communications department working simultaneously, carefully neutral, carefully non-committal, carefully designed to say as little as possible while appearing to say something meaningful. And every single time they've released one of these carefully crafted nothing statements, the public reaction has made things measurably worse. The statement they released in the immediate aftermath of the Cunningham controversy is a perfect example. It acknowledged that players have their own personal views. It reaffirmed the team's commitment to inclusivity and respect. It did not stand with Sophie. It did not stand against her. It occupied the most deliberately ambiguous middle ground possible, which is exactly the kind of response that satisfies nobody and infuriates everybody. Fans who supported Cunningham saw it as a passive-aggressive distancing. Fans who had criticized Cunningham's comments saw it as an implicit endorsement. The statement managed to alienate both sides of the debate simultaneously, which is genuinely impressive in its own terrible way.
What the front office failed to grasp, what they appear to still be failing to grasp, is that in a crisis of this magnitude, silence and ambiguity aren't neutral positions, they are choices. And they are choices that people interpret through the lens of everything else they know about your organization. When your biggest star is reportedly slamming lockers and confronting your coaching staff, when a former employee is making harassment allegations, when the White House is issuing statements about one of your players, and when your response to all of it is a series of carefully worded non-answers, you are not managing a crisis, you are watching it manage you. Coach Stephanie White's authority inside that locker room, according to every report coming out of people connected to the franchise, is effectively gone. You cannot survive as a head coach in professional sports the kind of public confrontation that Clark reportedly staged in that locker room. The moment a player of Clark's stature stands up and directly challenges your decisions in front of the entire team, and the moment that challenge becomes public knowledge, your ability to command that room is permanently compromised. Players who might have been on the fence about where their loyalty lies are now watching to see what happens next. And what they are seeing is a coaching staff that appears unable to control the narrative, unable to manage its biggest personalities, and unable to prevent its internal conflicts from becoming front-page news. The trust that is the foundation of any functional coaching relationship, the basic belief among players that the decisions being made about their careers are rooted in basketball merit rather than personal and political vendettas, has been shattered. And once that trust is gone, it is extraordinarily difficult to rebuild it in the middle of a season when every game matters and every controversy gets amplified by a media environment that is actively hungry for more details about exactly what is happening inside this locker room. The Indiana Fever built something genuinely special when they brought Caitlin Clark into this franchise. They had a chance to be the team that changed women's basketball forever. And right now, they are in very real danger of throwing all of that away because of a series of decisions that prioritized institutional control over human decency and competitive integrity. Zoom out from the Indiana Fever for a moment and look at what this situation represents for the WNBA as a whole, because the stakes here are much bigger than one team's locker room drama. The league is in the middle of what has been widely described as its most significant cultural moment in years, maybe ever. The Caitlin Clark effect has been real, measurable, and transformative. Ratings are up, attendance is up, sponsorship interest has grown. The mainstream cultural conversation around women's basketball has shifted in ways that even the most optimistic projections from a few years ago wouldn't have predicted. All of that momentum, all of that hard-won growth is built on the foundation of public trust and public interest. People are watching the WNBA right now because the product is exciting, because the personalities are compelling, and because there's a genuine sense that something historic is happening in women's basketball. But public trust is fragile, and the Indiana Fever situation is testing it in ways that the league's leadership has to be watching very carefully. When the most famous player in your league is reportedly staging a locker room rebellion against her own coaching staff, that's not just a Fever story, that's a WNBA story. When allegations of workplace harassment surface inside one of your most high-profile franchises, that's not just a Fever story, that's a WNBA story. When the cultural and political debate around women's sports gets ignited by a player on one of your teams, and when the White House weighs in, and when the entire sports media world is covering it, that is most definitely not just a Fever story. That is the biggest story in your league, and it is happening in real time. And the decisions that get made in the next few days are going to define the WNBA's institutional character in ways that will be felt for years.
The question of what happens to Coach Stephanie White is the most immediate and the most consequential. Reports suggest that the pressure from within the organization, not just from players, but from people at multiple levels of the front office, has been building steadily. The argument being made by those who want to see a change is straightforward. The relationship between the coaching staff and the locker room's most important players is broken beyond repair, and no amount of carefully worded statements or behind-the-scenes conversations is going to fix it. The only way to reset, according to this line of thinking, is a clean break, a change in leadership that signals to the players, to the fans, and to the league that the Indiana Fever are serious about getting this right. The counter-argument, which also has supporters inside the organization, is that firing White mid-season would create its own set of problems, that it would validate the narrative of a coaching staff under siege, that it would set a precedent for player-driven coaching changes that the league's leadership doesn't want to establish, and that the franchise would be better served by trying to stabilize the situation internally and making any personnel decisions at the end of the year when there's time to do it thoughtfully rather than reactively. Both arguments have merit, but the clock is ticking, and every day that passes without a decisive resolution is another day that this story stays alive, stays loud, and does more damage to a franchise that was supposed to be the crown jewel of the WNBA's new era. Here's what we know for certain as of right now. Sophie Cunningham said what she said, and she is not taking it back. Caitlin Clark drew a line in the sand, and she is not crossing back over it. The Indiana Fever front office has issued statements that have satisfied almost nobody. A harassment allegation has introduced a completely separate crisis into an already chaotic situation. The White House weighed in on a WNBA controversy, something that would have been almost unimaginable even 2 years ago. And Coach Stephanie White's authority over this locker room is, by every credible account coming out of people connected to the franchise, functionally finished. The Indiana Fever are facing a decision point that franchise leadership simply cannot avoid any longer.
The comfortable middle ground, the carefully managed ambiguity, the non-committal statements, the hope that this will all just quiet down on its own is gone. It evaporated the moment Caitlin Clark reportedly stood up in that locker room and made her position unambiguous. You cannot half-manage a crisis that has already gone fully national, fully political, and fully personal all at the same time. What this entire situation has revealed, underneath all the drama and the audio leaks and the locker room confrontations and the political statements, is something that was already there, already festering, already working against this franchise from the inside. The Indiana Fever has been sitting on a powder keg of jealousy, institutional friction, and mismanaged personalities all season. Sophie Cunningham speaking her mind didn't create this crisis, it just finally lit the fuse. The players at the center of this, Clark, Cunningham, and the teammates watching all of this unfold, are going to have to find a way to play basketball through it. They're going to have to show up to practice, to games, to media availabilities, and somehow compartmentalize an enormous amount of noise in order to perform at the level their talent demands. Whether that's possible in the current environment, with the current coaching staff and the current level of institutional dysfunction being reported, is a genuine open question.
But here's the thing that everyone talking about this situation keeps dancing around without quite saying directly. The Indiana Fever has Caitlin Clark. Whatever else is broken, whatever else is dysfunctional, whatever chaos is currently consuming that locker room, they have the most compelling player in women's basketball. And if there's anyone who has demonstrated the ability to cut through noise, to silence critics through sheer performance, and to make the people trying to hold her back look small by simply being great, it's her. The front office has a choice. They can keep protecting a power structure that has clearly failed, or they can build around the player who has already proven she is bigger than any controversy this league has ever seen. History is watching. The entire basketball world is watching. And right now, the Indiana Fever are running out of time to choose correctly. What do you think happens next? Drop your take in the comments. Do the Fever do the right thing, or does this franchise burn itself to the ground before the playoffs even tip off?